Stepping into Eden, yay, brother. Stepping into Eden, yay, brother. Hey, out there. Hey, out there. This episode really sucks. A lot. Hello, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Worst Star Trek Episodes. The top 10 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. I'm here to give my review for number 10, the number 10 worst episode, in my opinion, of course, of the entire Star Trek franchise, and that episode is The Way to Eden. Which is episode 20 of season 3 of Star Trek, the original series. So, The Way to Eden, it's a space hippie episode. Like, do I really need to give a description? A bunch of space hippies come on board and the Enterprise and start staging protests, and no, we won't go, and singing hippie songs, and they want to go to this Eden planet, and they go there to eat some poison fruit and die. That's the episode. So, yeah. It's funny, I don't know, because I try to do a lot of research for these episodes, particularly these top 10 worst, because as I said, this is the first in the series of videos where I'm going to deeply examine each of the top 10, my top 10 least favorite episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. And believe me, that was a very hard list to come up with, and it's a bit... You know, it could change on a whim, depending on my mood, so it's no way in shape or form written in stone, but it's kind of the best I could come up with, and this ended up in my number 10 slot because, yeah, it definitely deserves it. I would definitely say that this is amongst the worst of the worst of the worst episodes ever made. Now, it's funny because doing research, I find there are people who love this episode. I went to IMDb and I've read the user reviews, and there are some user reviews that give this a 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10, saying, come on, why are you rating it so low? This episode's actually great. You guys have no sense of fun. Come on now. The music's amazing, and it's a really fun episode. And one guy was even like, oh, I was a hippie back in the 60s, and this is exactly the kind of song that we would sing. Now, also, to give you more context on IMDb, this was the second lowest rated episode of Star Trek the original series on IMDb, so it's not like it was actually loved. Those positive reviews were far in the minority, and they're not alone. WhatCulture.com, or whatever they're called, they rated The Way to Eden as the worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise, so I'm actually being a bit kinder to it than they are, because it's only number 10 worst of the entire Star Trek franchise for me. And someone named James Doohan, I believe, or Scotty, said that this was his least favorite episode of the original series, that he did not like it at all. Also, Walter Koenig, who played Chekhov, said that this was his least favorite, or the low point of the show for him. And I think, to be fair, he was talking more of the portrayal of Chekhov in this episode, who he thought was acting really out of character. Not necessarily the entire episode as a whole, but still, that's not high praise. And D.C. Fontana, a well-known Star Trek writer. She was really involved with the original series, particularly in the second and third seasons. And it's just a classic, well-known writer. She actually wrote a couple episodes for Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, or one episode for Deep Space Nine. She actually said in an interview that Deep Space Nine was her favorite Star Trek show because it had really good fleshed-out characters. And I agree with you, D.C. Fontana. Anyway, she's credited for writing this episode. However, there's a couple episodes where she used a pseudonym. I'm trying to bring up the exact pseudonym, It was Michael something. Hold on, let's see if I can find it. Look at all this great research. I'm looking things up while I'm recording. I don't know. I can't find it. But her pseudonym was Michael something. And there's just an episode that she didn't think was good or didn't feel like she wasn't happy with the final product or what they did with the story. Michael Richards. Okay, there we go. Isn't that the guy who plays Kramer? Anyway, Michael Richards was her pseudonym. For certain episodes that she didn't like what they changed her script or her original idea drastically, where she felt like it was not what she wanted and she didn't like it, and so she said, take my name off of it and put this name Michael Richards. She did that for The Way to Eden, and she did that for That Which Survives, because she was extremely unhappy with what they did with this episode. Now, the original story idea for this episode by DC Fontana, which they drastically changed, was it was going to be called Joanna, and it would be about McCoy's daughter named Joanna. And she would come on the ship and have an affair with Kirk. And we would, to bring up the fact that McCoy has a daughter from his first marriage, where he's now, they divorced a long time ago, but they had a daughter together, and she's grown up now. I think she's supposed to be in her 20s, if I remember correctly. But anyway, this is an idea that DC Fontana and DeForest Kelley came up with together during the second season, and they kept trying to do this story with McCoy having a daughter, and so she wrote the script, and they completely butchered and changed it and made this crap episode instead, and so she wasn't very happy about that. Now, the whole concept of Joanna actually it depends on whether or not you consider this canon, but officially, I guess now it is canon because CBS wants more people to watch it so they can make more money. Joanna was mentioned in Star Trek, the animated series, an episode, and I talked about this when I covered this episode for my Patreon supporters. I had covered all the animated series episodes for Patreon only videos for those who support me on Patreon, and the episode I believe was called The Survivor, not to be confused with the Next Generation episode The Survivors, but that was actually a decent episode of the animated series, and they just casually mentioned in that episode that McCoy had a daughter, and I was like, wait, what? McCoy has a daughter named Joanna? So I researched it, and I was like, actually, yeah, DC Fontana and DeForest Kelley came up with this, and they tried to pitch it in here, and when that didn't work, they came up with another story idea that they were going to do in season 4, but of course there was no season 4, so that never got done either, and so they finally got it to slip it in the animated series. Even though we didn't get to meet her, she was mentioned, so it depends on whether or not you consider the animated series canon, whether or not Joanna is officially canon or not. There were some, speaking of canon, there were some non-canon novels that featured McCoy's daughter, Joanna, so they took this idea and ran with it. Anyway, they took the character of Joanna and turned her into, I have to look up her name, this stupid hippie chick that Chekhov had a thing for. Whatever her name was, doesn't matter. Ivanova. No, I'm thinking of Trump's daughter. I don't know what her name was. But anyway, they turned that character into that, and they turned, instead of having an affair with Kirk, she had an affair with Chekhov. And so that's why Chekhov, or Walter Koenig, who played Chekhov, felt like his character was acting out of character because it was originally supposed to be Kirk. And so the character was they didn't really change the script that much. And so Kirk was a bit more, more rigid, more adult, more like, command structure type, where Chekhov was always played as very youthful and rebellious and silly. And so he felt it was totally out of character for Chekhov to suddenly be acting all serious and saying, oh, you silly hippies, and I just want to do space exploration, because he should be right down there being silly with them, according to Walter Koenig. And I don't necessarily disagree. However, as much as I hate this episode, I kind of don't like the idea of of McCoy's daughter having an affair with Kirk. There's something about that, like, first of all, Kirk has affairs with everyone. I'm sick of it. Secondly, isn't that creepy? That's creepy to me, that you're gonna sleep with your best friend's daughter. That's creepy. Even if she's in her 20s, he's still, like, way older than her. I don't know. And despite the age difference, it's your best friend's daughter. I'm kind of glad they didn't do that, if I'm being completely honest. Not that, this is any better, but I'm still glad that they didn't do that. Anyway, so why is this episode so terrible? Why is it on my worst list? Okay, so I was trying to debate while I was watching this episode, like, because they have all these songs that they're singing, like "Stepping Into Eden," "Hey Brother," and they had like all these different songs. And as I said, like, some people actually really like these songs, and the actor and the writer, and like the two actors, the ones who were singing the song, they wrote these songs, they worked on the songs. I think they actually released the songs afterwards. Now, leaving aside, let's just slap aside my personal taste in music and let's label that irrelevant. I don't watch Star Trek for a variety show. I don't want musical numbers in my Star Trek. I'm sorry. Maybe it's me, my personal taste, because I'm very much against musicals. I don't like them. But regardless of my personal taste, again, slap it aside as irrelevant, Star Trek is not a variety show. It shouldn't be focused on music, and it's silly to do so. And this, of course, will come up in my top 10 worst episodes yet again. I think those from my channel know who I'm talking about. Excuse me. But yes, musical numbers should not be in the Star Trek. And so that is a huge strike against this episode. But it goes way beyond that. There's also the way it's incorporated into this episode is redonkulous. It is beyond silly, where they have that character, the hippie character who goes on board the Enterprise. They're all like barely dressed. He has his hairy chest showing, and he has his little musical instrument. I don't know if it's a guitar, but whatever the fuck it is, he carries it around with him everywhere, and he just starts singing randomly. "Oh, I got a checkup from Dr. McCoy." No, that is dumb. Alright. But it goes even beyond that. Because here's the thing. Well, first, before I go beyond that, let's stick with this for a moment. As I was watching this episode, I was trying to determine which is worse. The songs in this episode are "Stepping Into Eden" or "It's Been a Long Time." Now, I think I'm going to have to go with "It's Been a Long Time" because, yeah, that Enterprise theme song is, I still say, is the number one worst thing and biggest insult and biggest mistake, and it's just the worst thing about the entire Star Trek franchise. But this reminded me a lot of that, and I think they serve kind of the same purpose, and they kind of come off the same way, and that is they're trying to be all hip. It's a failed attempt to appeal to younger audiences by being all hip. Ooh, look at this! We're playing hippie music. Isn't this cool? Just in the 60s, just like in the early 2000s when Enterprise came out, it's like, ooh, we're playing rock music. Isn't this cool? Where it's not even during the time it came out, it was not cool. Which, I don't know, I'm just guessing with the original series, because of course I wasn't alive until 20, or maybe not 20, maybe 10 years later. 10, 11 years later, I wasn't even alive. So I wasn't around to know if this, but for what I would guess, despite what that particular IMDb user said, my guess would be, based on actually listening to music from this time period, from the 60s and what was popular, that this would be considered a bit cheesy and out of date even then. And so it's a failed attempt to be like, ooh, aren't we hip and cool? Hey, youngsters, watch this. Now, it should be noted, I should talk about the person who did end up writing this episode, who rewrote it from DC Fontana's original idea, completely butchered it in her opinion, although she didn't use those words exactly, but basically, I mean, I would say that if I were her. But his name is Robert Poltno. His name is Arthur Hinneman, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which I'm probably not. Arthur Hinneman, who at the time of writing this episode was around 58 or 56 years old. Now, I'm not being ageist or anything, but this episode is meant to appeal to young people. It's about the hippie movement, which was predominantly made up of young people, and it featured young people, and it's about young people, as written by someone who is nearly in their 60s. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think I can fucking tell. But that's just me. Someone who was born in 1910. Let's just let that sink in for a bit. But anyway, Arthur Hinneman, or however you say his name, wrote 3 episodes of Star Trek the Original Series. This one, The Savage Curtain, and Wink of an Eye. Now, Wink of an Eye, not the best episode ever, but it's not the worst episode. You wouldn't find it anywhere near on my worst list. It's not a terrible, terrible episode. Savage Curtain totally is, though. That was also considered for my top 10 worst, so I'll give you a slight spoiler. It didn't quite make it, but it was definitely in my top 20 worst. So, it's kind of not a coincidence that these episodes were written by this guy. Not a good writer, sorry. And in the 80s, he did sadly pass away in the 80s, although I don't know how sadly it was because he was probably really old. But anyway, in the 80s, what he worked on were ABC after-school specials. Now, I haven't seen any of them since I was a kid, but I would just imagine from memory, especially since it came out in the 80s, that if you were to watch those now, they would seem like the cheesiest fucking things ever. And again, you know, no disrespect to this guy who passed away, but if you're a shit writer, you're a shit writer. It doesn't matter if you're living or dead. And maybe not just a shit writer, maybe it's just kind of out of touch. Sort of, he was speaking to a generation that he didn't understand. So anyway, that's kind of the other main point about this episode, about what makes it terrible, is that it's about hippies, but it fails to understand the hippie movement at all. It's a stereotype, or it's trying to make commentary on this movement, but it completely misunderstands it. It's almost like a straw man argument in a way, because it's definitely, you can tell that they're trying to make commentary on the hippie movement, because they have, these space hippies. I don't even know what the fuck they call themselves, and I don't care. They're dressed like hippies. They're singing music like hippies. They're using their own, it's a made up slang, but they're using their own slang and lingo, kind of like hippies, and they do say "hey brother," and hippies often do. And I don't really, again, I wasn't alive in the 60s, so I don't know exactly what 60s hippies were like, but I did hang out with a whole bunch of hippies in the 90s, although you could say, well, that's the 90s hippies, not the 60s hippies, but still, I mean, I can see similarities, because they said brother all the time, and they had their own slang and way of talking, and people would whip out a guitar from time to time, but not just randomly like these fuckers do here, but they would often sing songs about love and peace or whatever. So I could tell this is a surface look at what hippies are, and and it's basically, it's putting them down. It's basically saying they're a bunch of ignorant kids who don't know what the hell they're talking about, who should stay out of, who are just fucking up political situations, and they're being entitled and intriguant. For example, because the space hippies come on board in the transporter room, and they sit down and refuse to leave and start going, won't go, won't go, won't go. And that is obvious call out to protests and sit-ins. Like there's a common protest that they had in the 60s, sit-ins, where they would go into a place they're not supposed to be and have protests and shout that they won't go. Hell no, we won't go. It was very common and stuff like that. And this was done for like civil rights reasons, to protest the Vietnam War and stuff like that. Important fucking reasons. In fact, this is something that would go down in history, and this is something you need to understand, that this episode was written while these events were occurring. Now, people like myself who were born way after were taught about this in school in history class, and were taught that this is a very good thing, that it helped bring about social change, that the 60s, and in fact a lot of people, especially in the 90s when I grew up, romanticized the 60s as being a really important decade, important movement for social change, and that the hippie movement was actually a very positive influence on that. Now, not every aspect of it was positive, obviously, but overall, particularly the protests and stuff, that they were very strong proponent for social change, particularly in the civil rights movement, and also the way they helped shape opinion on the Vietnam War, and how at the time people were probably like really pro-war, just like they were in the early 2000s with the Iraq War, but after time, it's come to see as like a giant mistake and something that the U.S. should have never been involved with, in a debacle, basically. And part of that was because of the social unrest. And this episode is basically putting it down as a bunch of ignorant kids who should just shut the fuck up, who don't know what they're talking about. And history has proven this writer, this old man, get off my lawn type, wrong, frankly. And so this episode is a moment in time where you see a moron. Now, there's another example I gave in another video I did. Can't remember if it was a Patreon only video or not. It might not have been. But speaking of the Iraq War, which I kind of see as my Vietnam because I was involved in some of the protests of that in the early 2000s, there was a science fiction novel written around 2004, 2005. It was a short story, actually. And in that short story, it was set in the future, like 2020, 2030, or whatever. And in that future, there was a Disneyland in Iraq. Really, this is what people actually fucking thought. They not only did they think the Iraq War was completely, totally justified, they think, we're spreading democracy, and they're going to become another America, and they're going to thank us. Like, they actually bought that shit. So, I would compare that short story to this episode, Way of Eden, that this is what people thought in the 60s. Like, people are going to hate hippies, and they're going to think that they're stupid idiots, and that's how history will remember them. And history has proven this writer wrong. Now, at the same time, they're putting down the hippie movement. They're trying to do what I said earlier. They're trying to actually appeal to younger audiences by saying, look, we're singing all these hip songs, and here's some hippies you can relate to. They're doing like the same thing simultaneously, which I think is pretty devious, in my opinion. Now, as I said, I did some research of some people's opinions on this episode, and I have come across the common opinion that some people are mixed on the portrayal of the hippies in this episode from a social commentary standpoint, because some people believe that, yes, as I just said, they're putting down the hippie movement and saying that they're morons who don't know what they're talking about. But on the other hand, they feel like it's an interesting concept for Star Trek, because Star Trek is shown as this perfect utopian future, and that they're showing that not everyone is happy with that perfect utopian future, and thus you have a counterculture that has risen up. But I would actually argue against that perspective, and I would disagree personally with that perspective, because I don't think that's what this episode's saying. I think this episode is saying these are idiots because the society's perfect, and yet they're protesting it anyway. Look at these morons who are so entitled, they're so privileged, they don't realize how good they have it, and they're still being not happy with it living in utopia, and they're still going to protest that and just find things to bitch about. That's what I think this episode's saying. And not that the utopian society of Star Trek is not as utopian as we thought, and that it's actually flawed, and some people are unhappy. It's more of there's morons who are never going to be happy, and they're going to protest everything. Because that's what I think this whole thing is saying about hippies. Is that, I mean, watching this episode, the way these characters are portrayed, the way they behave, they are very nonsensical. They're very, irrational, and they seem to just protest everything out of anything, and they have no real purpose. And as I said, hippies in real life were protesting fucking civil rights, all the racism, all the shit that was going on in the 60s. They were protesting the Vietnam War. As I said, history pretty much agrees this is an unjustified war that America never should have gotten involved with, and shit like that. They were completely justified, where these morons are just like, they have no reason to protest anything. They're just being, oh, no, go. They just sit in the transporter room and they walk around the ship like just blocking hallways for no good goddamn reason. That's what the writer was saying that the hippie movement was. That is a commentary here. Anyway, also I got to get into the leader of this hippie group, Dr. What's-His-Face. I should bring this shit up. Anyway. The leader of this hippie group was, some people believe, an analogy for Timothy Leary. I almost said Dennis Leary, but that's someone totally different. Timothy Leary, which I don't know very much about him. I vaguely recall hearing about him in the 90s, in the late 90s. But he apparently was a strong figure in the 60s, who particularly was focused on LSD and psychedelic drugs, and apparently was involved in the hippie movement. And apparently, according to some of the articles I read, he had a huge following of people who would follow him. Some people believe would blindly follow him. Now, he had a lot of supporters, particularly, as I said, I heard about him in the 90s, where a lot of famous actors and talk show hosts and stuff would speak very kindly of him and say that he was very important for the 60s. But it's obvious that at this stage in time, he was not looked on very nicely by most people, by the mainstream media. Nixon, which I think it was before this episode was made. I can't remember if it was before or after, but Nixon did call Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in America. So that was obviously sort of the mainstream, how they viewed him, even though he was viewed a bit differently. Although he still had his critics even up to today. But there's still a lot of people who thought he was an important historical figure. But some people viewed him as corrupting young people and having a bunch of blind followers. And that's obviously the view that this writer took. Now, and that kind of makes sense, because Timothy Leary was a university professor, and so he was an educated man. So that's why the character who with the big funky ears, who's the leader of this group in this episode, has also turned out to be really well-educated man. I can't remember if he was a professor exactly. I think he might have been a scientist, but someone along those lines. So that's what makes me think that that's right, that they were going for a Timothy Leary sort of thing, and the writer of this episode obviously didn't like him. Now, the other comparison I heard was Charles Manson, and that gets more to the negative aspect of the hippie movement, although I wouldn't really say that the Manson family were, they're often called hippies, but I don't know, I'm about to do the no true Scotsman here, but I don't think they were really hippies in the sense it was just some crazy, demented man who had a bunch of morons follow him because he's very charismatic. It has more to do with cults. He was kind of using the hippie movement in order to create his own little cult. So, yeah, you can call me a no true Scotsman, whatever, but I personally wouldn't put that in the same category. At least not the majority of the hippie movement in the 60s, which, as I said, was actually very important and helpful. Now, I actually don't think the Charles Manson thing fits as much because, as I said, the Timothy Leary analogy seems to fit a lot more because the ear guy in this episode is actually, he's educated and someone who's intelligent. Unlike Charles Manson, who was just some moron who's going in and out of prison, who was actually literally insane. Now, granted, the ear guy, I should look up his name, but the ear guy in this episode, also at one point, Spock, after talking to him, having a friendly conversation, is like, oh, do you think this? And he's like, no, I think that. Oh, yeah, nice civil conversation, and immediately goes to Kirk and's like, all right, that dude's insane. He's just crazy. So you could say that they were sort of getting elements into Charles Manson, who clearly was insane. But I actually, if I were to guess, I would say that the writer was saying that he thinks Timothy Leary is insane. So I want to stick with the Timothy Leary analogy and just say that this 59-year-old dude who obviously listened to Nixon, that he was the most dangerous man in America, believed that he was just insane because it's the only reason he could come up with for why someone who was a college professor who was highly educated would suddenly support this hippie movement. He must be crazy. And so that's what the writer wrote in and came up, because Kirk was wondering the same thing about the ear dude, and I still can't find his name. And they were like, Severin, Dr. Severin, sorry. Stop calling him the ear dude. He was Dr. Severin. So that's what they're saying about Dr. Severin, that, why would an educated man who went to, he was a scientist, why would he suddenly be involved with these idiots? And eventually Spock is like, he's insane, that's why. That makes total sense. This is obvious. I think, that would be my guess. Of course, I don't know this for sure, but I think that the writer here was making an analogy to Timothy Leary, and that he's basically saying he thinks he's insane. So, because why else would a educated man hang out with these hippies, deplorable hippies? Shut up, hippies. Now, and that gets into another thing, because I think that particularly Scotty in this episode, he was definitely like a get off my lawn character. He was like, why are these young people listening to them? Oh, these stupid young people, blah, blah, blah. Get off my lawn. I kept expecting him to say, get off my lawn. And turn that damn music down. God damn it. I think, and as I mentioned, James Doohan hated this episode. And I think that's obviously the writer who wrote this 59-year-old dude. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be ageist, but really it's obvious that he's out of touch. And proven wrong by history. That he was injecting his own feelings into the Scotty character, and that's why he wrote those lines for him. And I think James Doohan doesn't like this episode because he also knew that this was completely out of character for Scotty, and he sees what this guy was actually saying, and he probably thought it was just stupid. Speaking of being just stupid, why are they playing this stupid music over the other ship? You get the funky dude on the bridge of the Enterprise playing air guitar along with the music, and then Scotty just gives him the get off my lawn look. Like, how dare you? And even Sulu is like, they're all singing along, all the youngsters, and Kirk and Scotty are just like, what the fuck is it with these young people and the music? Again, this is the whole get off my lawn mentality that the writer's injecting into this episode. But why don't they just turn off the music? Why are they broadcasting it all over the ship? I don't fucking get that. And, come on. Alright. I can see how some people have, take the so bad it's good approach with this episode. And maybe that's why the people were saying, come on, it's a fun episode. Because the part where the security guard who's guarding Severin, Dr. Severin, the security guard who is guarding him is distracted by the music. He's going dun, 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 singing along with it, and so the other dude sneaks up behind him and knocks him out. That's so dumb. It's so dumb. That is so dumb that it's funny. I gotta admit, that might be so bad it's good. And there's other parts of this episode that are kind of like that. Now, let me talk about the whole Eden thing. The way to Eden. It's interesting again, and this leads back to my Timothy Leary. And by the way, did you know that Timothy Leary, his colleague, and when he was a college professor who were also studying psychotropic drugs, his name was Richard Alpert. I never knew that until I started doing research on that. And if you're a fan of Lost, if you watched Lost, you'll know how that's significant. I had no idea they took his name from that. But anyway, another thing Timothy Leary was saying is that he was a proponent for space exploration. Again, space hippies. And he wanted, he thought humans should go into space and create these bubbles of utopian, which he described as Edens. Now, granted, the research I did said that he came up with this in the 70s, which is after this episode was written. But surely he must have mentioned this or mentioned something about Eden before this episode was written, because that was way too much of a coincidence. Again, the Timothy Leary connections are just way too close. And whole space hippies things, like, come on now. But anyway, and again, and it shows that these stupid, again, it's the writer's intention, that's these stupid kids who don't know what the fuck they're talking about. They protest, and they're just fucking things up because they force the Enterprise to enter Romulan space, and they're going to start an intergalactic war, just like is him saying that, oh, you stupid hippies, you're going to start wars, you're fucking up the American system, god damn it, let Nixon, the best person ever, do his job. God, history has proven this guy is so wrong. But anyway, so yeah, and so he's basically saying they're so stupid that the what they're chasing, this dream they have of a utopia, is actually fake, and it's actually dangerous, and by chasing it they just poison and kill themselves, and saying how they're just gonna kill themselves if they actually get what they want. Alright, a couple more things I have to mention about this episode. First of all, this isn't really a review about the episode, what I'm about to say, but I thought I had to mention it because I was watching a YouTube video of a song from this episode, and one of the comments, it was absolutely golden. It had me laughing hysterically for a good 2 minutes. So the comment said, on the video that shows these hippies singing the song, dun, 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 and being hippies on the Enterprise, the comment said, actually, on second thought, let's not go to the Enterprise. 'Tis a silly place. Mighty Python reference if you didn't get that, but I thought that was hilarious. And another thing worth mentioning is the scene which I thought was absolutely... this shows just how horribly written this is. It's just a poorly written script. So after the dude Adam, who's the singing guy, he goes to the poisonous planet, and he eats a fruit, and he dies. And you know what Spock says? Captain Obvious, I should call him in this scene. He says, and his name was Adam! Get it? He ate a poison apple or poison fruit, and he died, and his name was Adam. Yeah, jokes and commentaries or anything or metaphors are so much better when you make it painfully obvious. I mean, this was such an obvious metaphor to begin with, but that's not enough. We have to have it spelled out for us. Thank you, Captain Obvious. It's so dumb. That's one of the dumbest things. It just shows you how horribly written this script is. Speaking of Spock, a lot of people were saying that he was out of character in this episode because he was relating to the hippie types, and he actually calmed them down and be like, I'm one. And I actually disagree with that. Because I actually think that's fine. I don't have a problem with that because, they're saying it's out of character for him because he's, all about logic, and these hippies are really illogical, so how could he relate to them? But he he's a scholar. He studies areas, and he's a good diplomat, and he would know how to study a certain group and relate to them, and he would find a way to relate to them on their level, even though he remains completely stiff and logical. He still finds a way to relate to them. I actually like that, to be honest. I actually didn't have a problem with that particular part of it. Now, I should also note that the dude who plays Adam, and I found this out when doing research, and this blew my mind. This actor later appeared on Deep Space Nine as the evil general, colonel, whatever rank he was, from Little Green Men, when Quark and Rom and Nog traveled back in time to the 50s. He played the military general who was like torturing them or whatever. And once I knew that and I was watching this episode, it's like, holy shit, that is that guy. You can totally see it's the same guy. It's hard to tell because in this episode he's being absolutely ridiculous hippie, but then he's playing like a military general or whatever in the other episodes. So it couldn't be further apart. And the actor said that he said that he agreed to come back to Star Trek only if they didn't have him going around shirtless and being ridiculous again. And so they gave him, I guess, the exact opposite of a part. But I thought that was pretty interesting. So anyway, my rating for The Way to Eden out of 10 is, of course, a 1, the worst. As I said, I mean, all of my episodes in my top 10 worst are going to have a 1. You know this. But I had to say it just to make it official anyway. Yes, this is a terribly written episode. It's goofy. It's silly. All the characters are out of characters. They're making a variety show by putting songs for no good reason except to try to appeal to young people and to Star Trek. And at the same time of showing the hippies, they're putting down the hippie movement and making commentary against hippies that they're just stupid kids who should just shut up and follow the rule, listen to your elders, and get off my lawn. That's basically what this episode's saying. And history has proven this writer wrong. Anyway, that is it for my review of The Way to Eden. I shall be back next week with my number 9 worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise. So be sure to check out my channel for that. Also check out my channel as I continue to cover other Star Trek videos as well as many other shows like The Expanse and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.